But my first real memory of not knowing who I am came with football. The World Cup when I was a kid, football. They asked me, who are you for? Like, Belgium, right? I said, nah, yeah, but, you're Japanese, no? Like, yeah, but, Japan doesn't even participate. Back then, Japan was not a football nation. So I'm like, no, I'm Belgium, of course not. And then the kid said, no, you cannot be Belgium, you have to be Japan. And then with other people, the next person asked me, who are you for? I said, Japan, because I thought that's the right answer. And they said, no, but aren't you Belgian? So whatever answer I gave to that question, it was always questioned again and again and again. So I always had to argue. And I realized that this type of questions is a questions that people from mixed origin get all the time. And it's because we get these questions that we doubt where we come from. It's not because deeply rooted in me there's a soul search or a search for identity. It's because the rest of the world wants to know who I cheer for, what kind of food I want to eat, that I doubt what the correct answer is. And throughout the years, I learn to answer, and that answer is a mix between how I feel and what I think people want to know from me. What do people expect to be the correct answer?
こんにちは、斉藤大和と申します。ボビーと呼んでください。日本で生まれてアメリカで育って今日本に住んでます。I think in terms of Japanese like identity, people want a yes or no, black and white answer. I remember back when I was this guy like a snot-nosed brat and thinking like really judging other Japanese Americans because they couldn't speak Japanese, but they would still call themselves Japanese. And I'd be like, you're not Japanese, like you don't even speak Japanese. And I really cringe like at my past self because like that kind of mentality is really dangerous. And I think, when you get to that level, you're like, well, my family is like from samurai lineage and like, my family is, and it's like, that doesn't matter.
This question is super simple. What is being Japanese?
That is a very difficult question to answer. Although Japan is an island nation, it has always had a lot of interaction with the Asian mainland and beyond. As a result, Japanese people have a lot of different ancestries, and Japanese people from Hokkaido are different from that from Honshu or Okinawa. But they are all Japanese. If I wanted to give a definition, it would be something like this. People who live in Japan, speak Japanese to some extent, and think of Japan as their home are Japanese.
It's easy to determine what's not Japanese, but it's harder to determine what is Japanese, so what's left. And the more I talk about this and the more I think about this question, the simpler my answer gets. And that is, it's what's on your passport. And it could be as simple as that. Do you have a Japanese passport? Then you're Japanese. You can compete in the Olympics for Japan. You can play tennis for Japan. Then you're Japanese.
After talking with so many Japanese people, they started to suggest a lot of similar ways to determine one's Japaneseness. Are your parents Japanese? Do you have Japanese nationality? Can you speak Japanese? Where did you grow up? And then I came across an academic framework that listed it out. It proposed 7 aspects of Japaneseness. Nationality or citizenship, quote-unquote pure Japanese genes. Language competence, place of birth, current residence, level of cultural literacy, subjective identity. In this framework, my wife would fall under quote-unquote most Japanese because she ticks off all the boxes. On the other hand, my kids, who are half Canadian, differ in a couple ways. They don't have quote-unquote pure Japanese genes. Sorry about that. They also weren't born in Japan, but otherwise, they'd be able to claim all other aspects of Japaneseness.
だから日本って日本の枠組みから外れた人たち、たとえ日本人 として生きてきたとしても、枠組みから外れた人たちは差別対象になっちゃうんですよ。だから日系人も変な日本人って言われたりするし、そう帰国子女ももちろんその対象になるし、枠組みから外れちゃう人、その枠組みに対してプラスアルファされた人もやっぱ同じ対象になっちゃうんですよね、日本だと。
ちょっと変だよねって。
そう。
なんかよくもう純粋なアイヌはいないっていうヘイトスピーチがもう本当うんざりなんですけど、その純粋な民族なんているわけないじゃないですか。どの時点で 100% だったのかっていう話で、純粋な和人いますかっていう話ですし、それ証明できますかっていう話ですし。
As it so happens, some people have started taking DNA tests to see how much Japanese they have in them, like Max Capo, who recorded his real-time reaction to his test results on YouTube.
Oh, I'm 48%. I'm actually less half Japanese than I thought. I'm 48% Northern Japan. What is Northern Japan? It's circled. I'm a little bit surprised because my mom is Japanese, but she actually has been told she looks a lot more like Inca Indian, which is like South America, I think. That's more related to like the Ainu people in northern Japan. So the fact that I'm 48%, does that mean my mom is Ainu?
If you go back to that academic framework, you'll see that pure Japanese genes is in quotation marks. Even though it was published before DNA ancestry tests were available to the public, it's been clear for a while that using genetics to determine whether you belong or not is quote-unquote problematic, to say the least. Other criteria can also be dicey to judge. Take cultural literacy. Is the naturalized Japanese who visits a Shinto shrine every day more culturally literate than the born and raised Japanese who visits once a year for Hatsumode? Does practicing Budo, martial arts like karate, make you more Japanese? The Pew Research Center did a global study, and of the 14 countries they polled, they concluded that language was the cornerstone of national identity. Interestingly enough, both the US and Japan had 70% of its citizens answering that being able to speak our national language is very important for being truly American or truly Japanese. If you throw in the additional 22% in both countries that think it's somewhat important, it's clearly seen as the most important trait for belonging to each respective country. For Japan, if you go back in time, in the mid-19th century, before the Meiji Restoration, people of different feudal domains could communicate with each other only by writing in Chinese characters. Even nowadays, language competency can vary so greatly, from local dialects to the ability to speak the formal style of Japanese called Keigo.
はじめまして、私はエイミと申します。メキシコから来ました。My full name is Amy Sofia Castañeda Cato. Yes, I have both. In Mexico, we use the dad's last name and the mom's last name.
She was born in Mexico and attended a bicultural Japanese-Mexican school there, but she recently moved to Japan for university.
Did you learn Japanese growing up or in school?
Yes, my mom taught me a little bit when I was a little kid, but it was really basic stuff. And in school, I had Japanese classes for 1 hour every day. And Japanese was more like a class, kind of like maths. You know, it's a class you have to take and you have to pass. So you end up not liking that class. They divided into levels. So, you know, like very basic and number 5, level 5, which was the highest one. And I was always in the highest one. But coming here to Japan, I realized it was not enough. I love living in Japan. I love their culture. I love being here. I love being Japanese. But I don't like the language. I don't like the language. I hate studying it. I don't like talking with it. I don't like using Japanese.
Hello, my name is Edo Inoue. I am a American-born Japanese citizen. What is the one thing that Japanese in Japan have in common that is like common to like 99.9% of the population? And I would argue that it's probably speaking the Japanese language morning to night. Like it or not, Japanese is not my first language, so I speak it with an accent, and I say things that are grammatically incorrect. I pass a JLPT 1.
For those of you that don't know, JLPT stands for Japanese Language Proficiency Test, and JLPT N1 is the highest level you can achieve. In English, the equivalent test might be TOEIC, or Test of English for International Communication. To achieve JLPT N1 status, online estimates vary from 2,000 to 5,000 hours of study required.
But anybody that has passed will tell you that once you've passed it, they'll say, congratulations, you hit the starting point. And that's where it begins. It doesn't mean you're fluent. It doesn't mean you're native. It's far, far, far from that. I realize that the Japanese language, because I can't speak it perfectly, is a career handicap and is something that I will always have to overcome. People that can't speak Japanese very well, they look at me and say, "Oh, but you speak it so fluently, and you speak it perfectly." And I say, "Well, if your Japanese was better, you would know that it's not."
そういうコメントとか聞くと、最初はなんかありがとうありがとうありがたいと思うんだけど、でもやっぱりそのコメントの理由だから優しいから本当に尊敬してるからそうやって日本語上手ですねって言ってるんじゃなくて、本当はなんかハーフの子にしては日本語が上手ですねとか外国人にしては日本語が上手ですねって。
Even for those born and raised in Japan, the Japanese you speak may not be standard Japanese, which is the kind of Japanese that you would hear TV announcers speak. For example, while this announcer is originally from Kumamoto in the south, he doesn't use his local dialect.
広島での1年の勉強を終え、帰国を前に平和公園の原爆慰霊碑に祈りを捧げました。
So if you didn't grow up in the Tokyo area, you may appear uneducated or unsophisticated.
Hi, my name is Ann Kuninaga. I'm from Okinawa, Japan, and I consider myself Okinawan and Japanese. When I talk to people from Okinawa, I talk like them, like Okinawan Namadi. But like in Tokyo, I talk to a lot of people who's not from Okinawa, so I try to like speak like the normal people, not from Okinawa. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that's kind of hard to like change like time to time.
There are moments where I have struggled a lot with what I need to do to be Japanese enough. Before I moved to the States, I wanted to gear up and take all the exams I could so that I can prove on paper how proficient I was in Japanese, because I felt like I would be challenged because of how I looked, how much Japanese I was able to speak or read or write. And so there are moments in time where I get frustrated because I've been in the States for so long where I lose my Japanese touch and I might do something that I might not have otherwise if I had been here like the whole time, you know.
One last point I'd like to make on language is that many of the interviewees chose to be interviewed in English rather than Japanese, even though their Japanese was stronger. The reason I was given by some is that they felt they could speak more freely in English. Now, a group of people who often struggle with the Japanese language are the Nikkei, which is the term for Japanese who emigrated from Japan to live in a different country. If you go to the Japanese Overseas Migration Museum, it's fascinating to see where the majority of Nikkei originated from. I actually went there with a couple members of a group called Nikkei in Japan.
Hi everyone, I'm Elena. So my story is I'm half fourth generation Japanese American. Originally, it was started to make like people like me who are like of Japanese descent, like give them a home in Japan, because a lot of us, we come here and we feel like people don't really understand us because we look kind of Japanese but kind of not, and we don't really speak Japanese often. But as this group has evolved, it's kind of become more just anyone who is of Japanese descent, but that doesn't really necessarily feel that they are full Japanese, like they fit in with like the homogenous kind of culture here.
Hi, my name is Nina. I was born in Japan and lived here until I was 8, and then I moved to the US. My mom's Japanese and my dad's American. coming back here to work as an adult has been a lot more of a challenge with my identity because I speak Japanese and I know all the customs, or most of the customs, and the way to get around and speak Keigo and everything.
Yes, Keigo. I mentioned this earlier, but Keigo is the formal version of Japanese, and you can find it used in Japanese workplaces. Carrying on.
But no matter how hard I try to fit in the situations where I should be Japanese, people don't look at me as Japanese. And I get very frustrated with how, people get really surprised by how I speak Japanese, or the fact that I can use Keigo, and they're like, oh, it's so embarrassing. I'm Japanese and I can't use Keigo like you. It's like, well, I'm Japanese too, but it's never Japanese enough.
When you want to be Japanese, I think others consider it to be very, very important that you actually speak it flawlessly. I find that a lot of non-native often try to catch up and learn Japanese because they think that then they will fit in better, but it doesn't help enough. It's not enough to speak Japanese, to be considered to be as Japanese as you'd want to be.
I tried to join our Nikkei student union as well at UCLA, and there was a large group of people who spoke Japanese, and I got asked the question like, oh, so you speak, you're Japanese, right? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, so you speak Japanese? I'm like, no. And then they're like, oh, so you're not really Japanese. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of like the epitome of my college existence, I think.
My family only knows English. It's like, and I think it's because of our unique experiences as Japanese Americans going through World War II and just having that traumatic past.
My mom taught me about my history as a JA, because I'm 4th gen, so that means my family went through internment, my grandparents went through internment that was really, really painful for them, especially my grandfather. He lost friends, people during the war, he lost his best friend, wouldn't talk to him anymore just because he had a Japanese face. They had things stolen from them, they had bricks thrown at them, just really, really bad things. And my mom was always like, you need to remember that. Oh.
All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. We are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency.
So that first video was made in 1942, soon after relocation orders were put in place. In their follow-up video, just 2 years later in 1944, you can tell the change in tone.
Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war. While they have many things in common with ordinary American communities, in the really important things, relocation centers are not normal and probably never can be. Home life is disrupted. Eating, living, and working conditions are abnormal. Training of children is difficult. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
Yeah, when I was 6 years old, my mom told me you're Japanese American, you have to act a certain way. You can't act out in public because your family went through so much,
At the risk of over-explaining, Nikkei in America and Canada, who were forcibly detained during World War II and taught how to be good Americans and Canadians at the camps, naturally wanted to fit into society and prove their worth when they got out. This meant abandoning their native language and culture. For their children and the generations that followed, many stopped being able to speak the language and understand the culture. This created a group of people who didn't quite fit into the country they were born in or the country their ancestors were from.
I don't really see myself as Japanese. And people, when I came here, they try to make me like, oh, you're an American. But I don't really see myself as just American. I see like there's Japanese and, there's all these different identities. But I know I'm Japanese American. It hurts so much to not be seen for like who you see yourself to be.
It's easy to see how looks can be so strongly tied to being Japanese, as the vast majority of Japanese look similar. Where I'm from, Canada, there is no way in the world that you can look at someone on the street and figure out if they're Canadian or not. There's simply too much diversity. But in Japan, if you see someone who's visually different from the rest, then there's a very good chance that they're not Japanese. However, even when a quote-unquote Japanese person learns that a person is indeed Japanese, their appearance can still color their judgment. On the other hand, those that do look typically Japanese, but don't have the same cultural or language proficiency, can really stand out, both in and outside of Japan.
I can't just say I'm Japanese because I don't look typical Japanese. Like I have to explain, like I can't just say Nihonjin desu, and because most people would be like, でも日本人に見えないんだけどになるから、やっぱりこう、まあ実はお父さんがアメリカ人でお母さんが日本人で私はハーフですっていう紹介が必要になる。
When people say mixed babies are cute, that really bothers me. Like, babies are cute. Babies are cute. Maybe some babies are not as cute as other babies, but it really bothers me when people say that. Because I feel like it others people of mixed roots in a way that's unnecessary. And it, like, makes it about how they look.
Ethnically, we're very diverse. Even as Asians, we have Chinese, Korean, different roots. To be Japanese ethnically, it's difficult to define that. You can look different. You can be non-Asian and be Japanese.
Like the outside looks Japanese, but I don't have a lot of connections like inside. It's really weird because if you don't have the language, if you don't do Japanese things, but you look Japanese, like what is the, how, I don't know. It's like a lot of questions.
Max had a funny story about his Japanese mother's family that he would visit regularly.
Basically, every time I would go visit them, my own oji-chan, my mom's brother, would always be like, "Oh, Max, like, お箸上手ですね." Or like, 納豆好きなんだ?すごい日本人っぽい. And I'm like, you do know I am the son of your sister. And I never could say it to him, but I always thought it was hilarious, like how he treated me so much like not Japanese, even though it's like, it's your own sister's son.
It's a loaded question if I say I'm like Japanese to like an Asian American, because from my experience, that will always provoke an argument.
I remember meeting this bus driver who saw me and said, "You Asian?" And I was like, "Yes." He was like, "Are you black?" And I was like, "Yes." And he was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then proceeded to like tell me that he was going to find an Oriental woman. He was gonna quit his job in New York and find an Oriental woman, and he was going to make children like me. Wow, that's new. Like, I didn't even know what to say.
私高校生の頃お寿司屋さんでバイトをしていたんですけれども、お寿司は握らせてもらえない。その理由はその見た目にこう合わないから、お客さんから見えるからっていうことだったみたいです。留学しに来てるのって偉いね、お寿司屋さんでアルバイトなんかして日本の文化好きなんだねってこう見た目で 手にこうストーリーを作り上げられるというか、こういう顔の人が日本の文化に触れていると、日本が好きで、日本っていう偉大な国の文化に触れるためにわざわざやってきて勉強しているというようなこう想像が膨れ上がるのかななんていうのは感じました。
どうぞ。じゃあ、はい、お願いします。まず何だったら100ドルお願いします。はい、わかりました。ありがとうございます。こういう撮影の時に必ず職務質問されます。理由は分かりません。警察から職務質問はもうたびたびされるし、だからといって殴られるとかっていうのはないんですけど、多分今までの人生で、300回以上はされてきてますよね。でも僕がスーツを着てれば職務質問されないんですよ。絶対されないです。だからそのスウェット着てたりフードかぶってたりしたらもちろんされるし。
A growing group of people that don't get much attention in Japan are refugees. While the number of refugees coming to Japan was quite low a couple decades ago, easier access to travel visas has caused a surge in recent years.
上海です。日本生まれのミャンマー人として、日本で生活していますが、国籍は今のところまだありません。本当に小学生の頃はやっぱり自分がまず外国人であるっていう自覚は一切なかったです。ずっと6年間カタカナで名前を書いていて、で、日本の人は漢字で書くところをずっとカタカナなので、そこでちょっと違和感があったぐらいで、自分はもう本当にミャンマー人であるっていう自覚は全くなかったですね。で、やはり中学に入ってからやはり周りからいじめを受けることになりまして、でそこでなんて言うんでしょう、自分が日本人ではないっていうところがすごくそのいじめを受けてすごい理解することができたんですね。自分はもう絶対どう頑張ってもその時はですね、日本人にはなれないから、だからミャンマー人としてやっぱり生きていかなければいけないっていうところで気持ちをやっぱポジティブに変えて、でそこで学校生活を送って、大学に入る時にですね、自分が行きたい学部がやっぱその留学が必要っていうことと、あとは自分自身海外とか日本へ行ってみたいっていう気持ちですごく考えていたんですが、その大学入試をする時にですね、その両親からやっぱ自分のステータスっていうのはそのパスポートがない、やっぱ無国籍なんですと。なのでやっぱすごく危ない状態だと。でそこでようやく自分がなんかミャンマー人でもなく日本人でもなく無国籍状態なんだっていうところを、そうですね、私が17歳になりますかね、その時に初めて知りました。
At this point, you might be wondering how Shankai could be a citizen of no country even though he was 17 years old. In Japan, citizenship is passed through jun sanguini, our right of blood, which is unlike much of the Americas, which is jus sali, our birthright citizenship. So despite being born in Japan, Shankai didn't automatically get Japanese citizenship.
現在やっぱ正直やっぱ自分の中でやっぱこれずっと無国籍状態を続くっていうのもやはり海外にもとても行きにくいですし、あとはその結婚することもできないんですね。でなのでやっぱそういった問題がすごく多いので、あとはその帰化することはできます。でただやっぱそこで問題となってくるのが、やっぱミャンマー人という国籍をもらうのか、あとはもう日本っていう国籍をもらうのかっていうところでは今もすごく悩んでいます。やはり天秤にかけた時にやはり日本の方がまだいろいろとなんていうんでしょう、汎用性が高い、いろいろと便利であるっていうところもあって、で今のところはちょっと日本の帰化申請をトライしてみようかなっていうふうに考えています。
In Japanese, those who have naturalized are known as kikasha. In comparison to other G7 countries, the amount of people naturalizing and becoming Japanese is quite low. This leads many to think that naturalizing is not easily possible. However, the success rate of applicants is incredibly high.
Unfortunately, I have the impression that a lot of foreign countries see Japan as closed and unwelcoming. This is really not true, and I would like to encourage people to come and see for themselves. If you really like Japan and want to live here, that is good too. You can become Japanese.
So Edo, who we met before, not only naturalized, but has a website where he teaches the ins and outs of naturalizing, as well as shares the stories of others who have become Japanese.
I'd say the top question I get asked is, was it hard? And I said, well, it's actually, it's not easy, but it's not as hard or as impossible as you might think.
There are 6 conditions for naturalizing, which I'll briefly summarize. 1. You need to live in Japan for 5 years. 2. Be over 20 years old. 3. Not be a criminal. 4. Be able to support yourself financially, which generally means you speak elementary school level Japanese and have a job, or you have a family member supporting you, or you just have lots of money. 5. That you'll give up any citizenship in any other countries, although there are some exceptions. And 6. You've never tried to overthrow the Constitution of Japan. Another common question Edo gets is why he chose to become Japanese.
Having permanent residency, that gives you permission to live and work here. And the optimist would say, oh, they would never, ever, ever take that away from me. But the person that looks at it from a life insurance point of view said, well, I'd rather have the right to live here and work here unconditionally. They can fine you, they can jail you, they can even execute you, but they can't deport you.
And in 2020, a permanent resident's ability to leave and re-enter Japan was temporarily paused as the government tried to control the spread of coronavirus. On the other hand, Japanese citizens did continue to retain their right to re-enter the country.
I'm David Chart. I'm Japanese, but I was born in the UK. I came to Japan 15 years ago when I was 31 and naturalized 2 years ago. It's part of the reason why I feel culturally Japanese in a lot of ways, because I do practice Shinto and that is really Japanese. I passed the exam that they set for lay people who want to take an exam about Shinto. I passed at the highest level, and none of the people I have encountered in Shinto have had any problem with the fact that I was not born in Japan.
The question I asked all people who naturalized was if it was hard to do so and why they chose to.
At the point I actually naturalized, I was just switching between 2 jobs. And so my most recent income was actually under 3 million yen. That wasn't a problem. So you don't have to be earning a high amount of money. You just have to show that you are earning and that you can probably continue earning. And I do know of people who are Southeast Asian, who work in factories and who have naturalized. When I made the decision, I'd been in Japan for 13 years. And by that time, Japan felt like my country. You get some YouTubers saying they would never naturalize in Japan because they want to be absolutely sure they can always go back to their own country. That's why I naturalized. I wanted to be sure that I could always come back here.
So it's kind of funny that when David was returning to his former country, the UK, he encountered some issues.
Had to line up in the non-UK, non-EU passports lane, which had a much longer queue. Got to the front, hand over my passport, and the immigration official looks at it, looks at me. I didn't know they handed these out. First time I went to the US, because that's where my father lives, the guy looks at my passport and says, Japanese passport. Why do you have a British accent then? My accent. My only theory is that he's had sensitivity training and has been told you do not tell people they do not look like their passport, but hadn't been told not to tell them they don't sound like their passport. Another visit to the UK, the guy told me, well, you don't exactly look like a typical Japanese businessman, do you? No. Have you been to the UK before? Yes, a bit. Wow, never seen this before. Someone not of Japanese descent with a Japanese passport. And the guy who was actually studying me says, yes, but is this okay? Hang on a minute, you're actually thinking about not allowing me to enter the UK because I'm white on a Japanese passport. That's interesting. Japan has always been no reaction at all, just thank you, sir. Even when I had someone who had Kenshu, say, trainee on her badge. So it's a virtual certainty that I was the first white person with a Japanese passport she'd seen, because there aren't that many of us. No, not even a flicker.
Even though he doesn't get any reactions at Japanese customs, that's not necessarily the case in his everyday life.
I stand out visually among the typical Japanese population. Japanese doesn't really have a word for Japanese people who don't look like most Japanese people. Foreigner is just wrong. Legally, I am not a foreigner. I am a Japanese citizen. This is my country. I get to vote. I can run for Prime Minister. You want a way to talk about Zainichi Koreans who have naturalized. They're Japanese. They were born in Japan. They were raised in Japan. Their native language is Japanese. Their parents were born in Japan. Their grandparents were usually born in Japan these days. How do you describe them? They're not Zainichi Koreans anymore, right? They are now Japanese. So Japan doesn't yet have language for this.
How do you pronounce your name again when you introduce yourself in Japanese?
Grizzderu Bari Joshua. And it's always difficult to say whenever I get called. And it's always Grizu. So I always say hi.
I specifically asked Josh the question about his name because using Western names in Japan can have issues. First, there's the length, since Japanese only have 2 names, a first and a last, while other countries can have 3, 4, or 5. The second issue is converting the name into katakana, which will almost never sound like the original name and makes the already long name even longer, due to the way katakana is written versus kanji. Now, if you look at David Chart's name in Japanese, you'll notice that the last name is in katakana and the first name is in kanji. I asked him why that was.
I did suggest that we could go for a kanji surname as well, but my daughter strongly opposed that because she is a half, and so she should have a name that is half katakana and half kanji. So I wasn't allowed to change the surname from what my wife had chosen when we got married. And I wanted kanji in the name, so I found some kanji for David.
My name is Barry Joshua Grisdale. I'm originally from Canada, but I became a Japanese citizen in 2016. So in my mind, I expected becoming a Japanese citizen would be a very grueling procedure and very difficult with maybe pushback from the people at the ministry. But in fact, everybody's very welcoming. They're very encouraging, and they provided all the information I needed to take the first steps. I also had a home visit. So the person from the ministry that came to my house, it was only about 5 minutes. They sort of just checked and sort of did a quick look around, checked my closet, and then that was it, kind of thing. There's always these stories about, they check your refrigerator to see if you're eating natto and stuff like that. Unfortunately, I had put all that natto in there for nothing. Yes.
In Japan, you get a caseworker who goes through all of your documents with you, tells you what you need, makes sure you've got the right things, tells you if you haven't got the right things and what you need to do to fix it, and sticks with you for as long as it takes to get your application fixed, and that's free. Now, the reason for that is not necessarily because Japan loves immigrants. It's because Japanese law says that central government bodies have to provide full help to enable you to fill in applications.
What I've experienced as a pleasant shock was that when I naturalized to Japanese citizenship about 8 years ago, the foreign ministry personnel was very friendly. They gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I was always a little hesitant and concerned that my disability would affect my application process. I've heard horror stories from on the news from other countries. Stories of people who want to immigrate from the UK to Canada, even that they have a family member who's disabled and being rejected because their family member would be a strain on the welfare system. So I was trying to be as proactive as possible. To say that I do have a disability, but here's my contributing back to society, the things I'm doing. Well, I was called by the government of Totori actually to come and check out the accessibility features of their tourist attractions. So it's great that they, even just in the public area, they have an accessible toilet. And it's well kept and quite nice.
Are you not nervous about this?
A little bit, but...鳥に来てからもう数時間しか経ってないんですけど、感動ばっかりですよね。みんなの優しい心とか、アイサポートで先ほどアイサポートの説明をいただいて、すごく。That was the biggest thing that surprised me, is that it didn't have any effect. They're mostly concerned about my stability as a Japanese citizen, whether I had employment, how long I'd been here, how many times I'd left the country, whether I was actually being part of Japanese society was more of an issue to the people in the ministry than whether I had disability or not, or whether I'd have some sort of effect on the welfare system. And then I first saw that I became a Japanese citizen in Kampo, which is sort of the government gazette. So every day in the morning, I would constantly be refreshing the website and checking all the names, and so it was a stressful couple months for me. But when I saw my name in there, I was so ecstatic, and actually I have it printed out. It's on my wall at work with my name highlighted on it. I became a citizen on August 29th in 2016. So I consider it my Japanese birthday. So I'm 4 years old in Japan.
How does it feel to be Japanese?
I still wake up sometimes and I get a smile to myself that, hey, I'm Japanese.
Remember how the nationality law basically doesn't allow for dual citizenship? While it's true in general, there are exceptions to this, and thus there are Japanese with dual nationality, like the children who have one Japanese parent and one non-Japanese parent, like my children. A more famous example was the tennis star Naomi Osaka. I say was, because before she turned 22, she decided to keep only her Japanese nationality. But for those who aren't in the limelight, the majority have actually never chosen, and thus still possess dual nationality.
Japan revised their national laws in 1985 to say that the big change back then was you could inherit Japanese nationality by birth, not just from your father, but from your mother as well. And they created the choice nationality law, which says once you become an adult, you then have 2 years to make up your mind and formally declare that you choose Japanese nationality. Now, it's on the books, but it's never been enforced. But that just because it's on the books and never been enforced doesn't mean they can't decide to enforce it in the future.
I only have a Belgian passport. I gave up my Japanese nationality when I was about 18 or so, because I was told I had to choose at 22. So I thought, why wait until I'm 22? I might as well choose now, because I live in Belgium. Living in Belgium or the Netherlands, where I live now, within the EU is much easier on a European passport than on a Japanese one. So for me, the choice was not only because I identify as Belgian much more, but also it's just easier.
アメリカ人と日本人の家族がいて一つの家族を選ばなくちゃいけないって言われたら、そんなの普通の人は選べないじゃん。だって両方とも愛してるし。
It's not an easy choice. It's choosing sometimes between your parents. So which one do you love most? Which country do you love more? It can be a practical choice. Japanese passport is really strong. But often it's also a choice of the heart. It's how do you feel like most. And a lot of half Japanese people would prefer to have dual nationality, dual citizenship allowed. One main thing against dual nationality, in my perspective, is military service. What if there's war? What do you do? Who do you choose for?
One unique story I came across was that of Jason's, a fellow Canadian. He always thought he was only Canadian, but when he applied for a student visa to study Japanese in Japan, he found out otherwise.
And actually, when I applied for my visa, when I got the news back, they rejected it, and I didn't know why. And they told me that my name was on the family registry, something my dad never bothered to tell me about. And so they made me go through this whole stressful process of getting my family registry from Japan and everything. By the time it was over and when they handed me a Japanese passport, it was kind of a weird feeling in a sense. And that I know that I'm not Japanese like everyone else who holds this passport because I grew up in Canada. But in some ways it kind of felt like I was validated in a sense when I was handed it. The embassy or consulate was very persistent on me getting the passport, actually. They were saying even though you're above 22, because you were born in Canada, they said that because you got your Canadian passport when you were born through birthright, that the Japanese government cannot take that away, technically. And so you are okay with keeping both. Which does not agree with any of the laws which are written on paper, I will admit.
Upon applying for passport renewal, many dual citizens will be handed a pamphlet saying that you must make a choice of nationality. So the fact that Jason was told to get a Japanese passport and not make a choice of nationality was surprising.
Yeah, in terms of Japan's, I guess, laws on passports and stuff and dual nationality, I don't know, I think they are outdated. 日本って結局いろんな国、いろんな文化、いろんな人々が最初から混ざってる国だから、いろんな人たちを日本に住まして成功させたら本当に日本の未来を多分救ってくれると思うんだけどね。
A question that came up over and over throughout all the interviews was how does someone actually be Japanese? What does one have to be to be considered fully Japanese? Talking with Japanese Americans, I learned the terms Junjapa and Junsui, which translate into pure Japanese and pure. Another common term is Nihonjinron, which is the theory of Japaneseness. More broadly, it's the idea that Japanese are unique. Believing in these kinds of ideas consequently means that there are only certain individuals that can be Japanese.
I always felt like it was an insider-outsider type deal. So it's either you're Japanese or you're not Japanese, and it wasn't all that relevant what exactly you were, besides the fact that you were not Japanese.
The best way to come to terms with who you are is just to accept that you'll maybe never be considered to be fully Japanese. Which for me is easy because I wasn't born or raised here and I don't have the ambition to live in Japan for the rest of my life. But if that's the case, then that might not be an answer that, you'd be happy with. Saying, you'll never be Japanese, be fine with it. So it's something that needs to be discussed, and what is Japanese is something that needs to be rethought over and over.
I think my identity is Zainichi Kankokujin, for sure, yes. That is where it originated, and I think it's going to remain that way, firmly.
But you're also Nihonjin as well, are you not?
Well, by nationality, but I don't think I'm Japanese. I would like to be close to the Japanese society as much as possible, but I probably will never be pure Japanese. I can never be, I don't think.
I struggled with that for a long time, what it is to be Japanese. Actually, when I say it now, I don't necessarily say I'm Japanese, I say I'm a Japanese citizen.
Because I don't have Japanese citizenship, but I grew up in Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah, for Western people, I'm Japanese. I know that, but but for Japanese people, I'm not Japanese. So, まあなんかみんなが勝手に決めてる感じだからな。What should I say?
本人が日本人だと思えば日本人なんじゃないかなと思うんですね。
Trying to be so hard accepted in Japan to be accepted as Japanese has not become an issue to me anymore. It was in the past, but I'm so many things. And that's something I hope other people who maybe feel like they have an identity struggle is to realize they are not just their own ethnic background. Like, your identity is who you make it out to be. And, you know, not everyone is going to accept maybe the fact that I'm Japanese, or maybe I'm not as Japanese as somebody who's born and raised here. But to me, that's just, it matters a lot less now because I know who I am and I know where I came from and I know my background. So I'm completely fine with that as it is. It is what it is.
That, by the way, was reference to Naomi Osaka's one-time Twitter status, where I'm guessing she was getting tired of the same questions. In fact, she even made an ad with Nike where she answered the constant questions she gets.
Do you consider yourself Japanese or American?
Shh. It's very unfortunate that some people still do not feel comfortable saying you are Japanese, you know, from the bottom of their hearts, because there's kind of like a small needle stuck in somewhere in your stomach saying, maybe you're not, you know, are you sure you're Japanese? But I don't mean to be kind of Socrates or anything, but being Japanese is just being Japanese. Either you have it or you don't, you know. If you think you're Japanese, you're Japanese, I think. You can go on about being legally Japanese, being what Japanese, being half Japanese, being quarter Japanese, but, you know, Japan is a nation state, and it's a nationality, it's culture. But if you're comfortable with being Japanese, you're Japanese.